Welcome to our Peace Dividend interview series, inviting some of the nation's most respected thought leaders to offer an objective look at U.S. foreign policy. Today, we are honored to have with us the distinguished, world-renowned peace and human rights activist, Ajamu Baraka. He grew up in the South Side of Chicago and served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. He has taught political science at various universities and has been a guest lecturer at academic institutions in the US and abroad. As a human rights defender whose experience spans 4 decades of domestic and international education and activism, Ajamu is a veteran grassroots organizer whose roots are in the Black liberation movement and anti-apartheid and Central American solidarity struggles. In 2016, he was the Green Party nominee for Vice President of the United States. He currently serves as the national organizer and spokesperson for the Black Alliance for Peace. Welcome, Ajamu. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
Today's interview focuses on 5 questions. World events continue to unfold at a quickening pace, facing an alarming escalation in tensions around the world. We look to Ajamu Baraka for his most current thoughts. As I've indicated before, we're focusing on the realities of the international power struggle unfolding in real time, specifically addressing the role of the US in the tensions and its capacity to reduce them. We hope to discover paradigm shift ideas for improving the prospects for peace. First question, we hear a lot of terms and acronyms bandied about: deep state, MIC, fire sector, ruling elite, oligarchy, neocons. Who actually defines and sets America's geopolitical priorities and determines our foreign policy, not officially, not constitutionally, but de facto?
That's a very important question, John, and is one that really challenges how we perceive how government works and the kinds of interests that the government or the state represents. For me, when I look at the area of foreign policy, it seems to me that the question is, what is a nation's foreign policy other than a projection of its geostrategic economic interests, in essence? And when you frame it in that way, then you are then led to begin to identify what are the predominant economic interests in that state that is represented by its foreign policies. When we look at the US foreign policies, look at the US state activities since just from the Second World War, it becomes quite clear that the predominant interests that are driving the foreign policy construction of the US state are those interests related to finance capital, the multinational corporations whose leadership is based in the United States. In other words, it is the capitalist economic elite. Now, of course, we live in a society that supposedly has democratic structures and relationships. So it's not an open sort of capitalist dictatorship, if you will. So there are other kinds of processes and groups that are involved in the conversation around what will be the predominant foreign policy of this nation state. We also recognize that even though we are talking about an economic elite, there are real differences among that elite. They have some common interests in terms of advancing the system, but there's still competition among them and competition around controlling the state in order to advance their particular sectorial interests. And where does that struggle take place at? It usually takes place, John, within the confines of the executive branch of the US state. That is where all of the various conflicting and sometimes contradictory interests of the ruling elite is worked out, or used to be worked out up until recently. You also have the Congress, of course, But in the Congress, we find that in particular over the last couple of decades, we find the Congress playing a less important role. They are usually there to basically rubber stamp, if you will, the predominant policies being advanced by whatever dominant sector of the ruling elite is in charge. So the long, shorter response to this important question is this. We have competing economic interests among the elite. Those interests get played out within the executive branch and to a certain extent in the Congress. There are structures in civil society that are part of the conversation that provides expert advice and information. The Council on Foreign Relations, for example, various departments throughout academia. But ultimately, we'll find that it is those powerful, dominant economic interests that drive U.S. foreign policy. And when you understand that the character of this state is that it is in fact an empire, then you can understand very clearly why we see the kind of aggressive policies that the state has embraced, in particular over the last 2 decades.
Actually, that leads perfectly into the next question. We've had decades of international tensions. Recent developments have seen a sharp escalation in the potential for a major war. I see in the news this morning that Poland is claiming that Russia has launched missiles into their territory, and they want NATO to invoke Article 5. The US apparently cannot be at peace. Threats against the homeland are allegedly increasing in number and severity. The trajectory of our relations with the rest of the world seems to be more confrontations, more enemies, more crises, more wars. So give me your take on this. Is the world really that full of aggressors, bad actors, and ruthless opponents? Or is there something in our own policies and attitudes toward other countries which put us at odds with them, thus making war inevitable and peace impossible?
Unfortunately, John, I think it is the latter. It is basically the commitment to U.S. hegemony that's been driving policies for the last 70 years. We see that from the end of the Second World War, before the nation was able to experience any prolonged peace, that was developing in Vietnam as the U.S. provided support to one of its major allies. And the story continues that basically, because there are the common interests between the U.S. And various European powers to maintain the predominance of the capitalist order against any challenges, against any efforts on the part of nations to build alternative systems or to attempt to exercise their own national sovereignty, that these states have found themselves in the crosshairs of U.S. and Western aggression. And from Vietnam, we've seen the story. We saw the slaughter in Indonesia. We saw the attempts to try to maintain British control in Kenya in the 1950s. We saw the contemporary wars, and we see the contemporary wars today that are being driven by the same kind of interests, be it from Afghanistan and Iraq to today Yemen, Syria, is being driven by this policy of full spectrum dominance. So it is not so much that there are these aggressions and aggressors in the world. It is the dependency on the part of these Western powers primarily to use force and aggression in order to maintain their hegemony, in order to maintain the relationships that help to produce what we know today as the West, Western civilization. that has been the unequal relationships, economic relationships, the relationships of plunder that the ruling elite is so desperate to try to maintain, especially now that there is one particular challenger to that hegemony. So it is these uh, irreconcilable economic contradictions that are driving policies and that are making the world a much more volatile and dangerous place, including this conflict we see that is still unfolding in Eastern Europe. And now with this notion that the Russians would deliberately send rockets into Poland, right at a moment, John, when there's been the conversation started again around the possibility of peace, advanced by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, right when there's more conversations around an off ramp from this continuation of this conflict in Ukraine, we're supposed to believe that the Russians would then shoot rockets into Poland, triggering discussions around Article 5 and consolidating a more solidified NATO response to the Russians. It makes no sense. But these are the kinds of activities, the kinds of behaviors we see from a desperate set of states that have concluded, unfortunately, that is only through force and aggression, illegal economic sanctions, subversion, that they're going to win the competition between themselves and the Chinese, the Russians, the Africans, and all of the other nations in the global South that are attempting to develop for themselves along their own paths new forms of nation states, new forms of social relationships, and a new dispensation of global power. The response from the West is quite clear. Either they're going to dominate, or they seem to be prepared to blow up the entire world.
Our leaders relentlessly talk about our national interests and our national security, warning that both are under constant assault. Yet we spend more than the next 9 countries combined on our military. Why does such colossal spending never seem to be enough?
It would never be enough as long as the ruling elite has concluded that the rules of economic competition, of so-called free enterprise, no longer apply, that they have to be jettisoned, that the most effective weapon that they have is the rule of the strongest. Then they're going to use as much of the public resources to arm the state in order to protect and to advance their interests as they can get away with. As long as there's not an effective anti-war movement in this country that can put a brake on these policies, then we will see a continuation of this reckless spending, this irresponsible spending on the part of the elites, right at a time where the cost of war is being shifted to the backs of the working class. The cost of the Ukrainian war has been tremendous with the escalation of inflation and the increases in fuel and food prices. It's been a catastrophe. But until there's a response from the public, then we're going to see a continuation of this spending, this plundering of the public resources. So it's never going to be enough until the people themselves are able to put a brake on this activity. Let's be reminded, John, that there's an ideological component to the activities of the ruling elite. Right after the Second World War, the containment policy that George Kennan talked about, it wasn't just a military containment, it was an ideological containment. And so they had to have containment ideologically, domestically, in order to galvanize support for the Cold War and to ensure that there was not going to be an effective counter movement domestically. Well, during this new Cold War, the objectives are the same, are very similar. that you have to have public support for these super aggressive policies. So you have to have a domestic ideological containment. That's why you see the state moving in the way it's moving with its allies in Silicon Valley, determining the range of acceptable thought and information in social media. So again, there has to be a pushback from the public if we're going to have a real democracy, and if we're going to have a break on these policies that are only taking us straight to a situation where basically we are facing a real existential threat to our continuation on this planet.
It's evident that you and the many individuals who follow you and support your work believe that America's direction in both the diplomatic sphere and the current conflict zones represents an exercise of government power gone awry. Can you paint for us in broad strokes the specific changes in our national priorities and policies you view as necessary for the U.S. to peacefully coexist with other nations, at the same time keeping us safe from malicious attacks on our security and rightful place in the world community?
Very, very important question, and something that we have to really give more thought to. Is one thing to be opposed, is something else to begin to envision how we transcend the current realities that we are facing. John, I really believe that we have to have a shift in values. We have to have an awakening among the public to the fact that we are in a very precarious place on this planet, and that this extreme nationalism that says that we are the best, we are the exception, that we can and rule the world and should rule the world, that we don't need to cooperate with our neighbors on this planet to solve these global problems, that is no longer tenable. That until it's quite clear, we have to have a shift in how we determine how we're going to live on this planet collectively. Now, the problem, though, is that it's not just a shift in consciousness, which is important, but what we have to have in order to have a new dispensation of relationships and power is to dislodge, to expropriate the power of these elements in our society, this minority element, this ruling element that has an interest in the status quo, that has an interest in things remaining just as they are. So what I'm saying, John, is that what people have to come to terms with, and it's a difficult thing to come to terms with, is that without a real social revolution in this country, without us being able to expropriate the power from this rapacious ruling elite that's only looking out for its own interests, without that kind of displacement, we're not going to be able to, in fact, live in peace, because peace for them is a threat, because they have to use violence and state violence in order to maintain their dominance. So, you know, these are objective interests. They're not the consequence of bad people. We're not going to persuade some of these powerful elements just to change. We're going to have to take power from them. We've got to take over the commanding heights of the economy. We have to bring about a new kind of authentic democracy here in this country. Again, in other words, if we're not prepared to engage in the horrific struggle that we have to engage in order to free up ourselves and global humanity, to live in peace, to be committed to social justice. If we're not prepared for that, then basically the alternative, in my opinion, is increased barbarism and the ultimate destruction of the human species on this planet.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And seizing power, if I may put a plug in for the Peace Dividend strategy, is exactly and exclusively what the Peace Dividend concept is about. This is the last question, and your answers have been so profound and so thought-provoking. I really appreciate this. This is the last question. The general public, especially when it's aware of the self-sabotaging results of our current foreign policies and military posturing, clearly wants less war and militarism, in spite of all the brainwashing. Preferring more peaceful alternatives on the world stage and a greater concentration on solving the problems at home. As peace activists, we are thus more in line with the majority of citizens on issues of war and peace than those currently in power. What happens if we determine that those shaping current US policy don't care what the citizenry thinks, are simply not listening to us? What if we conclude that our Congress, for example, is completely deaf to the voice of the people? What do we do? What are our options then? What are our next concrete steps as political activists in working toward a peaceful future? As a thought leader and advocate of dramatic reform, Ajamu, what do you propose?
Very interesting, John, that that question sort of piggybacks off of what we laid out a few minutes ago, that would be a tremendous development if people understood that there are objective interests in play here, that the rulers of this society, the representatives in Congress that have been bought and paid for by the capitalist elite, they don't listen to us. It's been empirically verified in 2014 by this marvelous study by Benjamin Page and Martin Gillis that said basically there's no democracy in the US. What we have, in fact, is an oligarchy. If people came to understand that, then it would be much more difficult for the ruling elite to manipulate the public, to support their aggressive policies, to allow themselves to be taken in over and over again by the elite. So that kind of development of consciousness will put us well on the road toward the kinds of social struggles we have to engage in order to change the entire society. It provides the foundation for the kind of struggle we have to engage in. And we have to engage in that struggle. So what we have to do, we have to believe in the possibility of change. We have to believe that we can be more than what we are today, that this kind of society that is infused with violence, the glorification of violence, of weaponry and insane, mindless violence that's directed toward people who live in this society, that we can be more than this, that this is not reflective of the apex of human development, but that we also recognize that if we're going to save ourselves and the generations after us, we have to struggle. We can't allow ourselves to be manipulated by appeals to nationalism, reactionary nationalism. We have to not allow ourselves to be mobilized to support aggressive U.S. policies in places like Haiti, and to reject the national security strategy that's committed the U.S. to full spectrum dominance. How do you have a humane societies when you have one society that is committed to dominating everyone else? We have to reject that. We have to reject any activity that's being taken in our name by this government that's in order to advance its narrow interests. So we have to squash all sentimentality. We've got to look at our objective realities soberly, and be committed to the possibility of real change in this country, and be prepared to, in fact, struggle for real change.
Well, that concludes our interview. I can't thank you enough. This has really been an amazing exchange of ideas. You providing 99% of it. So thank you again for your courageous, thoughtful, and powerful insights. And thank all of you out there who are watching this. And I'll make one last request to you folks. Please visit and spend some time on our website. This is a way to directly confront the imperial establishment, the war machine. Never give up hope and keep fighting for what's right. Thank you and good day.
Thank you, John.